Hi everyone, my name is Haley and this is my final presentation for SPE 223. Today I'll be sharing what I learned about disability inclusion, infrastructure, and how cities can become more accessible through universal design. Why I chose this topic. I chose this topic because the way cities are designed affects whether people can participate fully in everyday life. Sidewalks, transportation, and public spaces can be empowering or isolating. I wanted to understand how better design can promote true inclusion. I was able to interview Alex Rivera, who is a student studying city design and planning. He was inspired by growing up in a town with inaccessible sidewalks and transit. That experience led him to advocate for cities that are inclusive for everyone, especially those with mobility or sensory needs. And this is a quote from him where he says, "Growing up in a city with poor public transport and inaccessible sidewalks, I noticed how often people with disabilities were excluded from public spaces." Here were just some of the interview questions that I had asked Alex. What do you know about universal design? Universal design is about creating spaces that work for everyone, not just able-bodied individuals. It is about removing barriers before they even exist. Ramps, braille, signage, large hallways, these aren't just extras, they are essentials. What connections do you have to individuals with disabilities? My cousin uses a wheelchair and often cannot attend events with us because most venues were not accessible. It is upsetting, and it opened my eyes to how design choices exclude people from everyday life. Are there any cities that you consider to be great or inspirational? Copenhagen and Portland are great models. Both emphasize accessibility, public transit, and safe shared spaces. Even small touches like textured crosswalks make a huge difference. Overall, Alex emphasized the importance of universal design, which is designing environments that everyone can use from the start. He believes that many planners still assume able-bodied users and overlook the needs of people with disabilities. He also pointed out the lack of consultation with disabled community members during city projects. On this slide, I want to share a few of the most important things I learned from our course content and readings. First, universal design stood out as a key concept. Rossetti's 2006 article introduced the 7 principles of universal design, which are used to guide the creation of environments that work for everyone, not just the majority. These principles help make physical spaces more inclusive from the start, rather than relying on retroactive fixes. We also looked at the Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. Even though it was originally created for education, it can be applied to city infrastructure too. For example, using visual signage, ramps, or sensory-friendly spaces can help people with a wide range of abilities across public areas. The U.S. Department of Labor also emphasizes these ideas in its universal design guidelines. Next, I learned how bias and power dynamics affect accessibility. In the article from 2021, we were shown how race, class, and language influence which families are actually heard in educational policy discussions. These dynamics definitely show up in city planning too. Some communities just have more say than others in how things are built or maintained. Finally, I learned a lot from the NPR article about people with invisible disabilities. These are individuals with conditions that might not be immediately noticeable, like chronic pain or sensory disorders. The article talked about how people in this group often aren't believed or accommodated simply because their disability isn't visible. This has big implications for city design, and we need more quiet zones, flexible signage, and accessible seating for people whose needs aren't obvious at first glance. After going through my research and course readings, I identified several key barriers that prevent full accessibility in many cities. The first one is poor public transit access. Many bus stops don't have ramps or level boarding, and routes often don't consider people who use wheelchairs or those who live far from stops. Transportation is essential to daily life. Without access, people are cut off from work, healthcare, and many social opportunities. Another big issue is inaccessible or uneven sidewalks. In a lot of towns, sidewalks are cracked, narrow, or lack basic features like ramps, braille, or tactile paving. This doesn't just impact wheelchair users, it also affects people who are visually impaired or have other mobility challenges. Lastly, there's a major lack of representation of disabled voices in city planning. When people with disabilities aren't at the table during infrastructure discussions, their needs get overlooked or misunderstood. Planning with, not just for, disabled people is critical to making real change. Now that we've identified the barriers, here are some of the key solutions and strategies that came up during my research. The first one is implementing universal design from the start. Instead of adding ramps or accommodations later, cities should integrate accessibilities into every project from the beginning. Second is community feedback. City planners need to actively involve disabled residents when making infrastructure decisions. As Alex mentioned in our interview, lived experience offers insights that planners often miss when they rely only on policy or codes. Finally, education. If future architects, engineers, and city leaders aren't trained in inclusive design, the cycle of inaccessibility continues. This project answered a lot of my questions, but it really opened the door to several more that I think are really important to consider moving forward. First, how can cities enforce accessibility without relying on lawsuits or complaints? Right now, so much of accessibility work is reactive. Change only happens when someone speaks up or takes legal action. I think it's time we find ways to build accessibility into city policies from the very beginning, so it's not just about fixing problems after people are already excluded. Second, what policies can protect disabled people from being left out of smart city technology? Things like touchscreens, automated transit, and app-based services are becoming more common, but they don't always work for people with sensory, cognitive, or mobility challenges. If we're not careful, tech innovation could leave people behind. Finally, can smaller towns afford to invest in universal design? It's one thing to talk about accessible design in large, well-funded cities, but what about rural areas and small towns with fewer resources? What kinds of funding or support could help those communities prioritize accessibility too? These questions show that accessibility isn't just a checklist. It's an ongoing process that needs reflection, innovation, and commitment. In closing, this project reminded me that disability inclusion isn't just about policy or checklists. It's about real people trying to live their daily lives with dignity and independence. Cities shouldn't be designed for the majority and then retrofitted for everyone else. They should be built with the idea that diversity is the default, not the exception. When we plan with people at the margins in mind, those with disabilities, chronic illness, sensory needs, we end up improving accessibility and comfort for everyone. This project showed me that inclusion isn't just a one-time fix. It's a mindset. And if we truly want equitable cities, we have to start embedding that mindset into every sidewalk, building, and bus route. Thank you so much for watching my presentation. I hope it gave you a clear understanding of how urban design and infrastructure impacts inclusion for people with disabilities.